Hi everyone, welcome back. We're going to continue to talk about SQLite, and we'll do a quick SQL refresher so we can get the most out of SQLite. So as I mentioned, SQLite is pretty easy to use. It doesn't require a server. So how you launch SQLite is you go to the command prompt and type, let's say, SQLite 3, and then give the database a name, and it'll create a file which will be storing the data. So let's look at a toy data set. Suppose you want to store data about course information and also students who are taking the course. So what do? You first go into the SQLite command prompt by typing the command I mentioned. And then we go into SQLite's command prompt, where you can start to create tables and then populate the tables with data. So to create a table, you will say create table and then give the table a name, in this case student, and also the information that you want to store. In this case, we want to store two columns of information. One is student ID, which is an integer, and the student name, which is text. So you type that command, a table will be created for you. And pictorially is what you see at the bottom right. Two columns, ID and name. And to check that you actually created the table correctly, you can type .schema. That's a command specific to SQLite for printing out the schema of the database tables. After you created a table, then you want to insert data. And you use the keyword insert and say insert into which table, the student table. And you will specify the specific value, let's say student ID 111, and Smith is the name. Then insert one row into the table. And you can repeat for another student like Johnson, another one Lee. And after doing that, of course, you want to do a sanity check. So you will make sure everything is inserted correctly. And what you do is to select star. That means star is meaning everything you want to get. Select star from student, you get everything from the table. And let's say now we want to create another table to store course information. And we want to specifically know which student has taken which course. So we'll create another table called ticks. And in this case, we have three columns. The first one is student ID. The second one is their course ID. And the third is the grade that the student has received. So again, after typing this command, we can do .schema to print out the two tables that we have so far. The ticks table, pictorially, you will see that at the bottom right. Three columns. So suppose now we want to do a little bit more sophisticated. Specifically, we want to generate a roster for the course 6242 using the two tables that we created so far. So how do we do that? We use the keywords called join. So conceptually, that means we want to combine information from two tables. In this case, we want to find out which are the students that are in the class 6242. And by just eyeballing it, you already know that the students Smith and Johnson in both font down there are the two students in 6242. But how do we pull that information from the student table on the left to the student to the ticks table on the right? And we'll use a join statement. And you'll need to tell SQLite how you're going to join the information. And the way that we're going to do the joining is through the ID column in both tables. So specifically, we know that the student ID of Smith is 111, which also appears in the text table. So that means you want equality, or want the student ID to be able to link the two tables together. So what you would do is in the join statement, there's a where clause. This is where you specify the condition of how the two tables will be joined. So here you see that we want student.id equal ticks.id. So that is how we're going to check for equality. And also because we want to generate a roster only for the course 6242, we want to exclude the course 4000. You will also want to specify another condition, which is the course ID equal 6242. So that means you actually have two conditions here. One is for equality to do the actual joining, and then another condition there is to do the filtering. Another very common thing you may want to do is to summarize data. So let's say you want to compute the GPA of every student. So GPA is a summary, right? So what would you do? You will use aggregate function. So here we'll look at the ticks table. And because we want to compute GPA for each student, we want to find out all the courses that a student has taken. So here, student 222, you know that he or she has taken two courses, 6242 and 4000. And just visually, you know the GPA would be 85, just an average. So the actual statement you would use would be to include an aggregate function. In this case, we need to use AVG, which is average. So that means I want to find both the ID, student ID, and also the average grade, which is a GPA. And that's only part of the equation. You also need to tell SQLite how you want to group the information. So that means how do you want to aggregate information by what information in the data. In this case, we want to aggregate by ID, by student ID, because we want to take the average for among all the courses that student has taken. So that means you want to specify the ID as the grouping criteria. And specific keyword or key phrase that you want to use is group by. And you will specify that at the very end of the command. So the whole statement would be, I want to select ID, I want to select the average grade from the text table, and I want to do this aggregation, the grade aggregation by ID. What if you want to do some filtering, like what we did before to a generating roster? So you would use group level or aggregation level filtering. Specifically use the keyword called having. So let's say we want all the students or only the student whose average GPA is about 90. So what you would do is to add the having clause at the very end after the group by. And now we say, I only want the students whose average GPA is above 90. So having average grade greater than 90. So what we look at so far is just all the basics that you might need to know. Actually, there are quite a lot of other things that you would want to learn about. So what I would recommend is to take a database course if you haven't taken already. SQL is such a common thing that you will do in any company that you will ever join, ever work with. Sometimes they may not even say that is a requirement, but they actually want you to know about it. So I highly recommend taking a database course. And also noting that what we covered so far are some of the commands in SQLite. There are also some commands that are specific to Oracle or MySQL or Postgres that you want to learn about. So what we'll look at in this video is a very quick crash course about SQL. And as I mentioned, I highly recommend that you learn a lot more about it, because this is a skill that is very essential in data science.